Heroux. Gaetan has been an activist with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty for over 25 years. He's the co-author with Brian Palmer of Toronto's Poor, A Rebellious History. It's being published soon.
I want to start by thanking Scott, Carol, and Carl for allowing me to come and talk here, and inviting the others also to talk about, for some of us, what is a very, very important subject and issue in this city of Toronto. Although we've talked about things that have happened in the past, I'm going to talk about an incident that happened in the 1990s. So I'm not bringing you totally to the present, but I think a lot of the issues that are talked about or have been talked about continue to exist in this city. So just before I start, for people who don't know me, I've worked in the Dundas and Sherbourne area for the last 28 years in nonprofit agencies, and I've been an active member of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. My background prior to that was I was raised born in Quebec. My parents came looking for work in Ontario in 1965, and I was raised on welfare throughout that period until we came to Toronto. So that's my background, and that's usually the perspective I try and bring to some of these discussions. So what I want to try and generate a bit of a discussion, hopefully there'll be a bit of time after this, to generate a discussion in terms of the role of social agencies in poor people's movements. And the reason that this is a bit of a kind of a interesting issue for me, having worked in nonprofit agencies for that long, and have been active in a very militant anti-poverty organization, I want to kind of highlight some of the tensions that can exist as a result of that. And I've chosen an example that's from the book, actually, to kind of highlight that and hopefully to generate some more discussion from the example. So sometimes I'll read, sometimes I'll try and add a little bit more to. In the summer of 1997, I was working for Central Neighborhood House, a nonprofit agency located in the Dundas-Sherbourne area. I was the coordinator of Toronto's largest weekend day shelter, which provided basic services such as food and shelter to thousands of low-income homeless people living in Toronto, in Toronto's downtown east. Just so people understand, the downtown east Toronto has one of the largest concentrations of hostel beds and services and social housing in Canada. And thousands of people are living, trying to survive in that area. I've been trying to survive in that area. During this period, I was also an active member of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, an anti-capitalist organization dedicated to organizing the poor through direct action. CNH had a long progressive history of working with the poor dating back to 1911, when the agency opened its doors in the ward. Actually moved to the area, to the east end, to the area which was 1940s and Ontario Street in mid-1960s. CNH often worked with OCAP and supported OCAP direct actions. For instance, in the spring of 1997, when OCAP organized its first squat action, CNH allowed the weekend shelter to be used to mobilize the homeless and organize the takeover of two abandoned buildings on Carlton Street. 3 months later, however, CNH would break all ties with OCAP. And that's the story that I want to tell right now in terms of how that occurred. In 1994, the weekend day shelter was located on Parliament Street because the main CNH building on Ontario Street was undergoing major renovations. In the fall of 1997, when the renovations were due to be completed, the program was to return to the main building. In July of 1997, however, CNH's executive director informed staff that the weekend day shelter, which had operated out of the main building on Ontario Street since 1970, would not be allowed to return to the main building in the fall. Several months prior to the decision being made, the SEEP Ontario Berkeley Residents Association, known as SOBRA, and the Toronto Downtown East Richmond Association, Downtown East Residents Association, called TEDRA, and local politician Pam O'Connor were quietly meeting with CNH and pressuring the executive director and the board of directors to not allow the weekend day shelter to return to Ontario Street in the fall. Despite my protest and the protests of other staff at CNH, the executive director and the board refused to change their decision. The program would have to relocate somewhere else. I was called into a meeting soon after the decision was made, and during this meeting I informed management that I was resigning from my position as coordinator at the end of October, giving them time to find a replacement. I told management that in all consciousness I could not go to the people who would use the shelter, the weekend shelter program, and somehow convince them that this decision had been made in their best interest. Tensions came to a head a few days later when a controversial OCAP poster appeared in the neighborhood. In black bold letters stating, "Yuppie residents back off," the poster announced the OCAP's intention to march on the homes of residents and businesses that were attacking homeless services in the area. This is actually what the poster looked like, and it created havoc when it appeared. It was a cut and paste back then. We didn't have computers and stuff, but there were hundreds and hundreds of these that were spread throughout the neighborhood. I'll read you what the poster said. Yuppie residents have made it their missions to attack the poor and the homeless in the area. More interested in their property values than they are in human life, two residents groups, Tetra and Sobra, are trying to shut down the doors of vital services in their neighborhood. The already massive cuts to welfare and affordable housing have left tens of thousands of people and with no other alternatives to hostels and drop-ins like the ones in this neighborhood. I just want to stop there for a second. We're 2 years into the massive welfare cuts that happened in the fall of 1995 when Harris cut welfare. In terms of our community, it created havoc. Shelters were packed. Hundreds and hundreds of people were forced into the parks down by the Don Valley. There were stories of Seton House putting mats on the ground. It was just wreaked havoc. At the beginning of 1996, there were 3 men that froze to death: Eugene Upper, Erwin Anderson, and Marcellus Compani. And as a result of that, the city was forced to open up the Moss Park Armories for 2 weeks. Hundreds of people were coming every night to use the armories. And a year later on, in 1998, the fall of 1998, the city actually declared a national disaster, a homelessness national disaster. So these attacks are coming in the middle of this crisis. So there's a lot of anger, a lot of stress going on in terms of why are these people doing this in the middle of this period. Now these residence groups would see the drop-in day shelters driven from the area and people left in utter destitution. This attack, backed by some local politician, is clearly a part of the larger pattern to force the poor from the downtown core in order to make a room for yuppie communities and retail developments. I'm not going to say a lot about that, but this gentrification is really intensified since the Regent Park redevelopment that's started about 6-7 years ago. It's unreal in terms of the amount of pressure it's putting on the services. On August 5th, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty will be leading the march on the homes of these yuppies to challenge their plans. If they find the face of poverty so unpleasant that they want to drive it from the neighborhood, we will take it right to their doorstep and deliver the message that they keep their hands off the services. The poster, which had been plastered throughout the neighborhood, outraged local residents association. In a letter to Pam McConnell, dated July 24th, who was a local city councillor at the time, which was also CC'd to the CNH executive director, staff inspector Bill Blair. Bill Blair at that time had been called in to clean up 51 Division. Mayor Barbara Hall was the mayor at the time. Jack Layton got a letter and other politicians. Sobra called on CNH to fire Gaetan, which was me, and accused OCAP of being a terrorist organization. The letter read, Lisa Emmons and myself saw Gaetan pasting the attached flyer on the hydro poles at Sherbourne and Dundas. This is the way that we organize the community in the neighborhood. We would poster. He has continued throughout the Sobra and Tetra areas. The facts of these flyers are grossly exaggerated and highly inflammatory. The tone is extremely violent. and he is inciting riot. We have witnessed firsthand that he is capable of violence, vandalism, and antisocial behavior. We view the fire as a threat that is targeting our homes. We request that on August 5th, considerable numbers of police officers be available for our protection. The regular foot patrol is not sufficient. We also request that Gaetan be removed as an employee at Central Neighborhood House immediately. We support Tetra's request that a police investigation of OCAP and their activities be conducted. This organization is a political animal trying to achieve their objectives through terrorism. This is pre-9/11. It's time to stop these tactics. I was again summoned to the Executive Director's office and was asked if I intended to attend the OCAP demonstration, and when I answered in the affirmative, I was fired. CNH, however, agreed to pay me wages until the end of October. The local battle over the weekend day shelter had caused the agency great stress, as can be seen from the following memo, which was distributed to the staff soon after I was fired. Now, remember, this is one of the most progressive agencies in the neighborhood. Actually, when I came into Central Neighborhood House 10 years before that, David Kidd was the coordinator of the day shelter. He actually hired me, and had a big reputation in terms of fighting for the poor. So the memo reads from the Executive Director: "This is an important memo to let everyone know CNH's opposition to the Ontario Coal Shares Properties protest in the neighborhood to take place on August 5th, 1997. CNH is opposed to this protest as OCAP is intending to demonstrate outside the homes of our neighbors. This action in turn will damage our reputation with our funders and our ability to offer services to this community. CNH has appealed to OCAP not to protest at people's home, and our requests have been denied. CNH has come under intense scrutiny and criticism from residents and funders." I'm going to stop there for a second. The Residents Association actually contacted the United Way, and the funding of CNH was actually threatened as a result of these letters, and that's what he's referring to. Since the protest was advertised last week, we are now battling the public misperception that CNH, or by extension, our staff, has some role in organizing it. Please be advised that the agency has taken the following steps with regards to the protest. No flyers advertising the event will be allowed in CNH property or our program space, and no promotion of this event will be permitted. Now remember, 3 months ago, we were using the day shelter that had 400 to 500 people a day coming through to organize for a takeover of an empty building, and with the condolence of the Executive Director of the CNH. OCAP will no longer be welcome to use CNH space for meetings or to make use of any other resources we make available to community groups. Staff are strongly encouraged not to participate in the protest. Staff who do choose to participate in the protest, which takes place outside the neighborhood's homes, are in conflict with staff code of ethics and could face consequences with regrets to their employment with CNH. I want to stress that this is an unprecedented situation. In the 4 years I have had this job, I have never had to write a memo like this. So this was tense. This was a very, very tense period in terms of, a local fight that was going on. Even Jack Layton at some point, contacted OCAP and asked OCAP not to march on the homes and the residents. On August 5th, some 200 people, many of them homeless and low-income people who use the homeless services in the area, gathered in Allen Gardens. After several speeches, the demonstrators began their march through the neighborhood, with Bill Blair and dozens of police officers on bikes and on foot watching closely as the march made its way to the homes of residents who had been leading the fight to push homeless service out of the area. The march ended without incident 2 hours later. Just in terms of the follow-up of the demonstration, All Saints Church, where OCAP had been meeting regularly, kicked us out of the church. The CAW wrote letters to the organization threatening to pull our funding. And in terms of just what happened to the drop-in the end, is that it was relocated several times in the fall. And in 2002, operations of the shelter, the day one of the largest city shelters, ended. The program no longer exists. I just want to end by saying, that, and I hope that people have questions about in terms of what this raised, but in terms of for me, the question is raised is in terms of a worker who came to Dundas and Sherbourne in 1988 and entered a culture that existed at Central Labour House that really allowed me to understand what was going on in Dundas and Sherbourne was very, very important, and it's very important that culture be maintained. And I would argue that today it's very, very hard to find agencies who are willing to stick their necks out in terms of those things. But more importantly is the question of what is the responsibility of myself as a worker in terms of what on a daily basis I see happening at Dundas and Sherbourne in terms of the violence and the deaths and that kind of stuff. And what is the role of the agency in terms of what they see on a daily basis? Because you have to understand that on a daily basis, agencies like Central Limerick House, All Saints, all of these agencies, Dixon Hall, Regent Park, on a daily basis would see hundreds of people coming to their doors in terms of struggling around the poverty that they have, and what is our role in that. And my take on it has always been is that we have to speak out. At times where I couldn't do this through the agency, we would do this through the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. But as you see from this instance, when some of these values clash, there was some severe prices to pay. It was very important for OCAP to have access to the church and Central Neighbour House because we needed meeting space. We at one point we'd have 100 people that would come to our meetings, and we need to meet somewhere, right? And when we have big actions, we needed kitchens. And historically, we were able to use All Saints Kitchen. There's pictures of that. And CNH would allow us to use Park. So all of these things are needed. But then when these kinds of tensions and battles happen, there's a lot of pressures put on the agencies. And an agency, for me, that had a long history, had to make a decision that for me must have been very unpleasant, but they nevertheless made the decision to shut down or not to allow them to come back. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that this our talk will generate some discussion.
From interviewing Jack Scott, who was a part of this, his notion was that a lot of these neighborhood workers associations, while the heart and soul that were actually communist rank and file figures, but they existed outside in some senses of the leadership reach of the CP, even though it would have been in Toronto. The Toronto leadership was there. On the whole question of protesting at private homes, yeah, this is a very touchy issue. And in fact, in British Columbia in 1983, in the Solidarity Uprising, it was a central issue. And when Women Against the Budget organized a stone soup luncheon at Grace McCarthy, who was the Minister of Welfare's home in Kitsilano, it actually created probably the biggest stink of that early solidarity agitation. And it created there too fissures between the labor movement, where the trade union leadership basically always thought that the private sphere was untouchable. And in some senses they felt that because they themselves had been targeted, some of them, or they knew people who had been targeted in the McCarthy era. And their own, private lives had been intruded on. The difficulty with that is something that I was trying to get at in the necessity of defending both and struggling both at the points of production and reproduction. And I think sometimes you do have to actually make that step into the so-called private sphere, because that private sphere is actually organized in ways and is taking steps that actually intrude upon possibilities, alternatives, and foment the ongoing, crisis.
So we have a long ways to go, and as we haven't had a contract for 2-3 years, haven't had a raise in almost 3 years, and we're being told there's no money. And unless we begin to organize and say that this stuff is important, we're in trouble. Personally, labor law or no labor law, but yeah. I think looking at organizations like OCAP and the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee when they were around and stuff, we've always struggled in terms of infrastructure, in terms of having enough money to. I mean, I'm a member of OCAP, but I've always had much better wages than the organizers, John Clark, Lisa and Sue when they were there, and Sarah. I've always had, and I've had benefits. All of those people didn't have. So I'm just saying. So, but I guess my point I want to make is that in terms of the union, and I've always I refuse to give to the United Way. That's just me. I'm just going to, and it dates back maybe to the Associated Charities of Toronto with Goldsmith when they formed, and because that's where but the reason I do that is and what really irks me somewhat is that the unions will encourage their workers to make massive donations at their workplace, to do all kinds of events, to raise money for the United Way. And I'm not saying don't give to the United Way, but by God, redirect some of that money, some of those funds, and allow communities to develop infrastructure so that we can begin to fight, whether it's Jane and Finch, Black Lives Matters, and all that. I mean, they just recently $40,000 went to Black Lives Matter. That's important for that organization, and it's important for other organizations to get that.
This came about because I have just written a little book on the history of suffrage. It's a book intended for teaching, particularly at the sort of late high school and university level. It's not something that I've written on before. I actually sort of surprised myself by wanting to do it. I didn't think it was something that I was interested in, but the reason I became interested and the reason I wanted to do it, actually, once I got into it, was because I wanted to retell the story about fighting for political rights by adding a class analysis, by highlighting the way in which socialist women, labor women in particular, their contributions have been sidelined. But also to disrupt this view that is so well marketed, and you point out Nellie McClung's name. We should have a little button with Nellie McClung and a strike through it. Which is that the suffrage movement all happened just around the time period I was talking about, and there's sort of a triumphalist tone to it, which speaks to something David raised, which was that struggle was not over. There were continuing struggles over just being allowed to vote. Even more recently, incarcerated people, right, had to fight for their right to vote. So I wanted to disrupt this idea that it was just all happened at once, that it was only sort of liberal feminists that did it, and also raise the other question about the vote, which is that the women I was talking about understood that political rights were not equality. They might lead to equality, but they understood that social conditions needed far more, that you had to have equality of social conditions. So they had a critique of capitalism, and they knew that just having the vote would not do it. You had to have other kinds of social transformation. And I think a lot of that has been so lost in the mainstream popularization of women's history that we need to recoup it. I know suffrage seems like kind of a far away esoteric topic, but I think it does have messages for today about the necessity of maintaining that long history of socialist feminist organizing in Canada, which has gone up and down over time, but we have to sustain it now.
I agree with David that you have to fight on more than one front. But we face a particularly stark time and a particularly difficult time. And for the trade union movement, I agree with the notion of trade union renewal. What I would argue is that historically trade union renewal, which we've faced many times in the past, the necessity of that, has never happened without the input of the left. It just hasn't. So, and we also face the reality now that the left has never been weaker, than it is in our times. If you look at the history of the last 100 years, you can go back and you can make a pretty clear case that the left, in it, however you want to define it, and however inclusively you want to make that left, it has never been weaker and in some senses more marginal now. And it's also it is connected to the trade union movement. There's an umbilical cord between the left and the trade unions. But you could also make the case that that a revolutionary oppositional left within the unions has never been weaker now than it has been in many other points in the past. So one can fight on all kinds of fronts to create new legislation, to create new possibilities, to expand understandings of where class struggle is located, how it needs to be understood, and where it needs to go, which is part of what I was trying to talk about, and I think what everybody was talking about. But the task is a very daunting one right now, and it involves rebuilding the left, rebuilding the unions, and we've got so many social movements and so many areas where there have been new breakthroughs. And you know, if you in teaching this year, I ran into this. The students that one teaches think that there's this effervescence of social movements, and we're in a very great time for the left. And you try to say to them, well, and they say, well, Black Lives Matters is so important. It is. I'm not denigrating that. But when I say to them, you know, it doesn't have the impact that, say, the Communist Party had in the 1930s. They look at you like you're from another planet. They're saying, well, of course it did. I mean, communists are just nothing. But the fact of the matter is, you know, whatever you may think about, you know, the CP, and I'm not a great fan of it for various reasons, but you look at what the left was in the 30s, its connection to the unions, and how struggles were mounted in a moment of crisis. And we are so far away from that. And we have made such great gains in all kinds of ways. But we need to marry the kind of advances that have happened since Seattle in 1998 and the left protests that have come about through anti-globalization, anti-capitalist movements. That kind of left with the sensibilities and organizational impulses and sophistications of an older left, which has been, in some senses, lost to the consciousness of a current generation. So it's a big task, but it involves rebuilding the unions, rebuilding the left, and bringing, you know, diverse social movements and coalitions which are fragmented and isolated into a kind of common discourse and a set of common practices. That's a big task, but I think without that, the march of austerity just goes on